The First Sino-Japanese War was fought between the Qing Empire of China and the Empire of Japan, primarily over control of Korea. After more than 6 months of unbroken successes by Japanese land and naval forces and the loss of the Chinese port of Vaiwei, the Qing government sued for peace in February 1895. The war demonstrated the failure of the Qing Empire's attempts to modernize its military and fend off threats to its sovereignty, especially when compared with Japan's successful Meiji Restoration. For the first time, regional dominance in East Asia shifted from China to Japan. The prestige of the Qing Empire, along with the classical tradition in China, suffered a major blow. The humiliating loss of Korea as a vassal state sparked an unprecedented public outcry. Within China, the defeat was a catalyst for a series of political upheavals led by Sun Yat-sen and Kang Youwei, culminating in the 1911 Xinhai Revolution. The war is commonly known in China as the War of Jiawu, referring to the year as named under the traditional sexagenary system of years. In Japan, it is called the Japan-Qing War. In Korea, where much of the war took place, it is called the Qing-Japan War. Background: after 2 centuries, the Japanese policy of seclusion under the shoguns of the Edo period came to an end when the country was forced open to trade by American intervention in 1854. The years following the Meiji Restoration of 1868 and the fall of the shogunate had seen Japan transform itself from a feudal society into a modern, industrial state. The Japanese had sent delegations and students around the world to learn and assimilate Western arts and sciences, with the intention of making Japan an equal to the Western powers. Korea continued to try to exclude foreigners, refusing embassies from foreign countries and firing on ships near its shores. At the start of the war, Japan had the benefit of 3 decades of reform, leaving Korea backward and vulnerable. Conflict over Korea as a newly risen power, Japan turned its attention toward its neighbor, Korea. Japan wanted to block any other power from annexing or dominating Korea, resolving to end the centuries-old Chinese suzerainty. As Prussian advisor Major Clemens Meckel put it to the Japanese, Korea was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. Moreover, Japan realized the potential economic benefits of Korea's coal and iron ore deposits for Japan's growing industrial base, and of Korea's agricultural exports to feed the growing Japanese population. On February 27, 1876, after several confrontations between Korean isolationists and Japanese, Japan imposed the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876. Forcing Korea open to Japanese trade. Similar treaties were signed between Korea and other nations. Korea had traditionally been a tributary state of China's Qing Empire, which exerted large influence over the conservative Korean officials gathered around the royal family of the Joseon Kingdom. Opinion in Korea itself was split. Conservatives wanted to retain their traditional relationship under China, while reformists wanted to approach Japan and Western nations. After fighting 2 opium wars against the British in 1839 and 1856, and another war against the French in 1885, China was unable to resist the encroachment of Western powers. Japan saw the opportunity to take China's place in the strategically vital Korea. 1882 crisis. In 1882, the Korean peninsula experienced a severe drought which led to food shortages, causing much hardship and discord among the population. Korea was on the verge of bankruptcy, even falling months behind on military pay, causing deep resentment among the soldiers. On July 23, a military mutiny and riot broke out in Seoul in which troops, assisted by the population, sacked the rice granaries. The next morning, the crowd attacked the royal palace and barracks, and then the Japanese legation. The Japanese legation staff managed to escape to Kimulpo and then Nagasaki via the British survey ship HMS Flying Fish. In response, Japan sent 4 warships and a battalion of troops to Seoul to safeguard Japanese interests and demand reparations. The Chinese then deployed 4,500 troops to counter the Japanese. However, tensions subsided with the Treaty of Chimolpo, signed on the evening of August 30, 1882. The agreement specified that the Korean conspirators would be punished and 50,000 yen would be paid to the families of slain Japanese. The Japanese government would also receive 500,000 yen, a formal apology, and permission to station troops at their diplomatic legation in Seoul. Gapsun-Q in 1884, a group of pro-Japanese reformers briefly overthrew the pro-Chinese conservative Korean government in a bloody coup d'état. However, the pro-Chinese faction, with assistance from Qing forces led by the General Yuan Shikai, succeeded in regaining control in an equally bloody counter-coup. These coups resulted not only in the deaths of a number of reformers, but also in the burning of the Japanese legation and the deaths of several legation guards and citizens. This caused a crisis between Japan and China, which was eventually settled by the Sino-Japanese Convention of Shinsein of 1885, in which the two sides agreed to pull their expeditionary forces out of Korea simultaneously, not send military trainers to the Korean military, and give warning to the other side, should one decide to send troops to Korea. Chinese and Japanese troops then left, and diplomatic relations were restored between Japan and Korea. However, the Japanese were frustrated by repeated Chinese attempts to undermine their influence in Korea. Yuan Shikai remained set as Chinese resident, in what the Chinese intended as a sort of viceroy role directing Korean affairs. He attempted to encourage Chinese and hinder Japanese trade, though Japan remained Korea's largest trading partner, and his government provided Korea with loans. The Chinese built telegraphs linking Korea to the Chinese network. Nagasaki Incident. The Nagasaki Incident was a riot that took place in the Japanese port city of Nagasaki in 1886. 4 warships from the Qing Empire's navy, the Beiyang Fleet, stopped at Nagasaki, apparently to carry out repairs. Some Chinese sailors caused trouble in the city and started the riot. Several Japanese policemen confronting the rioters were killed. The Qing government did not apologize after the incident, which resulted in a wave of anti-Qing sentiment in Japan. Bean controversy. A poor harvest in 1889 caused the governor of Korea's Hamgyong province to prohibit soybean exports to Japan. Japan requested and received compensation in 1893 for their importers. The incident highlighted the growing dependence Japan felt on Korean food imports. Kim Ok-guin affair. On March 28, 1894, a pro-Japanese Korean revolutionary, Kim Ok-guin, was assassinated in Shanghai. Kim had fled to Japan after his involvement in the 1884 coup, and the Japanese had turned down Korean demands that he be extradited. Ultimately, he was lured to Shanghai, where he was killed by a Korean, Hong Jong-yu, at a Japanese inn in the international settlement. His body was then taken aboard a Chinese warship and sent back to Korea, where it was courted and displayed as a warning to other rebels. The Japanese government took this as an outrageous affront. Donghak Rebellion. Tension ran high between China and Japan by June 1894, but war was not yet inevitable. On June 4, the Korean king, Go-jong, requested aid from the Qing government in suppressing the Donghak Rebellion. Although the rebellion was not as serious as it initially seemed, and hence Qing reinforcements were not necessary, the Qing government still sent the General Yuan Shikai as its plenipotentiary to lead 28,000 troops to Korea. According to the Japanese, the Qing government had violated the Convention of Shinsein by not informing the Japanese government of its decision to send troops, but the Qing claimed that Japan had approved this. The Japanese countered by sending a 8,000 troops expeditionary force to Korea. The first 400 troops arrived on June 9 en route to Seoul, and 3,000 landed at Incheon on June 12. However, Japanese officials denied any intention to intervene. As a result, the King Viceroy Li Hongzhang was lured into believing that Japan would not wage war. But the Japanese were fully prepared to act. The Qing government turned down Japan's suggestion for Japan and China to cooperate to reform the Korean government. When Korea demanded that Japan withdraw its troops from Korea, the Japanese refused. In early June 1894, the 8,000 troops captured the Korean king Go-jong, occupied the royal palace in Seoul and, by June 25, replaced the existing Korean government with members of the pro-Japanese faction. Even though Qing forces were already leaving Korea after finding themselves unneeded there, the new pro-Japanese Korean government granted Japan the right to expel Qing forces while Japan dispatched more troops to Korea. The Qing Empire rejected the new Korean government as illegitimate status of combatants. Japan's reforms under the Meiji Emperor gave significant priority to the creation of an effective modern national army and navy, especially naval construction. Japan sent numerous military officials abroad for training and evaluation of the relative strengths and tactics of Western armies and navies. Imperial Japanese Navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy was modeled after the British Royal Navy, at the time the foremost naval power. British advisors were sent to Japan to train the naval establishment, while Japanese students were in turn sent to Britain to study and observe the Royal Navy. Through drilling and tuition by Royal Navy instructors, Japan developed naval officers expert in the arts of gunnery and seamanship. At the start of hostilities, the Imperial Japanese Navy comprised a fleet of 12 modern warships, the frigate Takaro, 22 torpedo boats, and numerous auxiliary, armed merchant cruisers and converted liners. Japan did not yet have the resources to acquire battleships and so planned to employ the Jeune-École doctrine, which favored small, fast warships, especially cruisers and torpedo boats, with guns powerful enough to destroy larger craft. Many of Japan's major warships were built in British and French shipyards, and 16 of the torpedo boats were known to have been built in France and assembled in Japan. Imperial Japanese Army. The Meiji government at first modeled their army after the French army. French advisors had been sent to Japan with 2 military missions, and the establishment of artillery and engineering regiments as independent commands. By the 1890s, Japan had at its disposal a modern, professionally trained Western-style army which was relatively well equipped and supplied. Its officers had studied in Europe and were well educated in the latest tactics and strategy. By the start of the war, the Imperial Japanese Army could field a total force of 120,000 men in 2 armies and 5 divisions. China. The Beiyang Army and Beiyang Fleet were the best equipped and most modernized Chinese military, but suffered from corruption. Military leaders and officials systematically embezzled funds, even during the war. As a result, the Beiyang Fleet did not purchase any battleships after its establishment in 1888. The purchase of ammunition stopped in 1891, with the funding diverted to renovate the Summer Palace in Beijing. Logistics were lacking, as construction of railroads in Manchuria had been discouraged. The Qing Empire's military morale was generally very low due to lack of pay, low prestige, use of opium, and the poor leadership which had contributed to defeats such as the abandonment of the very well-fortified and defensible Viai Beiyang Army. The Qing Empire did not have a national army. Following the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing Army had been segregated into separate forces based on ethnicity, etc., and further divided into largely independent regional commands. The war was mainly fought by the Beiyang Fleet and Beiyang Army, whose soldiers were mainly from the former Huai Army raised to suppress the Taiping rebels. The Qing government's pleas for help from other regional armies and navies were ignored due to rivalry among the different regional commands. Beiyang Fleet. The Beiyang Fleet was one of the 4 modernized Chinese navies in the late Qing dynasty. The navies were heavily sponsored by Li Hongzhang, the viceroy of Zhili. The Beiyang fleet was the dominant navy in East Asia before the First Sino-Japanese War. However, ships were not maintained properly and indiscipline was common. Sentries spent their time gambling, watertight doors were left open, rubbish was dumped in gun barrels and gunpowder for explosive shells was sold and replaced with cocoa. At the Yalu River, a battleship had one of its guns pawned by the Admiral Ding Rushang. 13 or so torpedo boats, numerous gunboats and chartered merchant vessels. Foreign opinions of Chinese and Japanese forces. The prevailing view in the West was that the modernized Chinese forces would crush the Japanese. Observers commended Chinese units such as the Huai Army and Beiyang Fleet. The German General Staff predicted Japanese defeat. William Lang, a British advisor to the Chinese military, praised Chinese training, ships, guns, and fortifications, stating that, in the end, there is no doubt that Japan must be utterly crushed. Contemporaneous wars fought by the Qing Empire. While the Qing Empire was fighting the First Sino-Japanese War, it was also simultaneously engaging rebels in the Dungan Revolt in northwestern China, where thousands lost their lives. The generals Dongfuzhang, Moran Liang and Ma Haiyan were initially summoned by the Qing government to bring the Hui troops under their command to participate in the First Sino-Japanese War, but they were eventually sent to suppress the Dungan Revolt instead. Early stages of the war. The 1st of June 1894. The Donghak rebel army moves towards Seoul. The Korean government requests help from the Qing government to suppress the revolt. The 6th of June 1894. Approximately 2,465 Chinese soldiers are transported to Korea to suppress the Donghak rebellion. Japan asserts that it was not notified and thus China has violated the Convention of Shanxi, which requires that China and Japan must notify each other before intervening in Korea. China asserts that Japan was notified and approved of Chinese intervention. The 8th of June 1894. First of approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and 500 Marines land at Jamulpo. The 11th of June 1894. End of the Donghak Rebellion. The 13th of June 1894. The Japanese government telegraphs the commander of the Japanese forces in Korea, Otorike Suket, to remain in Korea for as long as possible despite the end of the rebellion. The 16th of June 1894. Japanese Foreign Minister Mutsu meets with Wang Fengzhou, the Qing ambassador to Japan, to discuss the future status of Korea. Wang states that the Qing government intends to pull out of Korea after the rebellion has been suppressed and expects Japan to do the same. However, China retains a resident to look after Chinese primacy in Korea. The 22nd of June 1894. Additional Japanese troops arrive in Korea. Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi tells Matsukata Masayoshi that since the Qing Empire appear to be making military preparations, there is probably no policy but to go to war. Mutsu tells Otori to press the Korean government on the Japanese demands. The 26th of June 1894. Otori presents a set of reform proposals to the Korean King Gojong. Gojong's government rejects and in return insists on troop withdrawals. The 7th of July 1894. Failure of mediation between China and Japan arranged by the British ambassador to China. The 19th of July 1894. Establishment of the Japanese Combined Fleet, consisting of almost all vessels in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Mutsu cables Otori to take any necessary steps to compel the Korean government to carry out a reform program. The 23rd of July 1894. Japanese troops occupy Seoul, capture Gojong, and establish a new pro-Japanese government, which terminates all Sino-Korean treaties and grants the Imperial Japanese Army the right to expel the Qing Empire's Beiyang Army from Korea. The 25th of July 1894. First Battle of the War.